All right, so tell me if this sounds familiar to any of you. You have a boss, an employee, or a colleague who is driving you crazy because they just don't listen, or they make these crazy snap judgments without considering the impact it's going to have on you or other people. Or they sit around and they blame everyone and everything else under the sun and never look at themselves and how they might be contributing to the challenges. Have you been in the room with that person? I see a lot of nods. So here's the thing, we all face these leadership challenges most likely on a daily basis. There is a pretty good chance that somebody is complaining in the same way about you right now. And I'm not saying that to make y'all paranoid about your colleagues, but simply to point out that at any stage in time, we have the propensity to become somebody else's leadership challenge. As a leadership development specialist for the State Department, I provide training to people across the department on things that you've probably all heard about or even taken classes on. Empathy, self-awareness, active listening, being proactive. We learn these things, sometimes even from a very young age. And yet I will be the first to admit to you all here today that there are times where I just wait for someone else's mouth to stop moving so I can tell them what I really think, where I rush to judgment based on my own preconceived notions rather than taking in more information, and where I perhaps blame the bureaucracy and the management for things that I might have control over, and countless other things that we in the leadership world frown upon. So does that mean that I am a fraud as a leadership specialist? I hope you don't think so. I don't think so. I can engage in these good practices, and I have done them, in fact, quite well, if I do say so myself. But I'm human, and there are times, especially when times get tough, that my basic human instinct kicks in, and unfortunately, sometimes these leadership practices go out the window, and I fall into some bad habits. And that's the thing about leadership development. It's a lifelong process, and it's not just about developing knowledge and skills. It's about having the courage, the self-discipline, and the willpower to constantly be going back to those bad habits, especially when the risk is great and the stress is high. If any of you have tried to lose weight or get fit at some point in your lives, we all know that crash diets do not work. In the short term, you might lose a couple of pounds, but you can't sustain yourself on the cayenne pepper and cabbage soup diet for very long. We all know, it's common sense, what it takes for us to have health and wellness for a long period of our lives, right? Eat healthy, balanced meals, exercise regularly, drink lots of water, get plenty of sleep. These are basic principles that nobody tends to disagree with, and yet why don't we do them? Because it's hard, right? It takes lifelong habits, and it takes an intentionality, and only we have the power to control our own instincts when it comes to that. The same thing applies with leadership. You can take some classes, you can read some great management books, and perhaps your behaviors will change in the short term when you're really truly invested and perhaps it's fresh on your mind. But then the day-to-day stresses of the job start to seep in. Chaos and crisis occurs, and all of a sudden we find ourselves in a place where we are practicing bad habits again. So as leaders, as reflective leaders, it's incumbent upon all of us to develop the habits that will last a lifetime rather than just focusing on some of these skills that sound good and are common sense but much more difficult to put into practice on a regular basis. So I'd like to offer you 3 habits, if you will, that I think will be effective for your lifelong leadership fitness regimen. Are you ready? You've heard them all before. Empathy, self-awareness, and feedback. We hear this term empathy in our lexicon all the time, but what I'm talking about is truly letting go of my own judgments, my own biases, my own ideas in my head about how I would do things differently, and putting myself in another person's space. Taking the time to ask, what are the values that this individual holds most dear? What are some of the stresses and the pressures that they might be under that's causing them to act in a way that's creating a leadership challenge for me? Self-awareness, it's not just about knowing ourselves, it's about really taking a good long look in the mirror and recognizing how my blind spots, my ego, and perhaps even my imagination are getting in the way to effective communication. Effective self-awareness requires me to have humility and to have the confidence to take responsibility when I make mistakes. And finally, feedback. Eliciting feedback from supervisors, from peers, from subordinates, and listening to that feedback. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change everything that you do, or even that you have to agree with an individual about the feedback that you're giving you, but take it as valuable insights into how other folks are experiencing you. And give feedback early and often. Rather than waiting until the crisis hits or conflict is inevitable, take the time to have a conversation with somebody early on when you've got concerns. So in summary, don't wait until you are in a position of authority to count yourself as a leader. We as leaders have the responsibility at every stage in our career to take a step back and identify what are some of the things that I can change about myself so that I'm not somebody else's leadership challenge. Thank you.